Something that we have to consider here is that there could be a hostile state actor that has been involved in this. And the most likely possible actor would be, or most possible likely state would be Russia, bearing in mind that we are fully aware that they have been scrutinizing our critical national infrastructure. They have been caught undertaking surveillance or hostile reconnaissance on a number of different locations. And to be honest, it doesn't fit within the general frameworks of what a terrorist would generally target, which it would be for maximum publicity. When one targets part of critical national infrastructure, this is generally trying to target against the state itself and trying to disrupt the country. And bearing in mind this substation was a principal supplier of electricity to not only Heathrow Airport, the busiest airport in the world, and part of that CNI, that critical national infrastructure, but also took out the power to 16,000 homes, allegedly, in the surrounding area. In the 1970s, the UK government, military, and intelligence agencies formulated a group known as the ATST, the Anti-Terrorist Survey Teams. And their responsibility was to carry out what one would term as key point security surveys. And these would be surveys that would address government, military, and royal households and buildings in such a way that if a hostile state actor or hostile special forces or terrorist organization were to disrupt, destroy, or sabotage, how they would best do it. And within this, it doesn't simply look at cameras, points of access and egress, but would look at also utility supplies, whether that be electricity, gas, or any other means of supply, communications, cables, etc., to those sites. Now, a substation should fall within that kind of key point security survey. It should be tested for its resilience. It should also be tested to be protected, but also it should be considered with various risk mitigation measures to prevent it being disrupted, because substations do not self-combust. And bearing in mind that one very notable operation by a terrorist organization, as was the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, they looked at trying to target substations around London in 1997. Now, that plot was foiled, thankfully, by MI5, but that plot would have resulted in London blackout for possibly months. So this is not a new potential threat or modus operandi of attack. And where it differentiates from a terrorist, as I've mentioned, is that terrorists will look for maximum publicity. Hostile state actors will look for maximum disruption. Well, of course, it's very early days right now as to who or what could be responsible for this substation being disrupted. Depending, again, without knowing this specific substation or physically seeing it or visiting it with my own eyes, it's difficult to say how well protected and prepared it was for any type of attack. But certainly in terms of, I would say there could be a combination of not only poor planning in terms of business interruption or possible sabotage, which could be kids setting fire to something. There should have been some kind of fire suppressant system in place to protect against those kinds of eventualities. And local kids don't fall outside of the spectrum of threats that one needs to consider. But if this was a hostile state actor, this could have been incredibly and would have been incredibly well planned, involving probably some extended period of reconnaissance or hostile surveillance, if you want to call it, to determine how best it could be disrupted. Where would it be disrupted? Is it internally? Could it be done externally? Would it look at conduits as to where cabling, where power supplies are coming in to feed that substation? Again, this would require a specialist level of skill. The repercussions of this substation being taken out has caused considerable damage to Heathrow's operational status. At the moment, we're in the preparations, and I think we need to consider the preparations for potential conflict with Russia, which we all hope will be diffused before they can be realized. But the considering of just simply launching ballistic or nuclear devices or missiles is pretty much an end game strategy. it is more likely to take place in disruption of countries, disruption of infrastructure. And if it is Russia that is behind this, and they would be the most likely candidate if it's deemed from the subsequent investigation that this wasn't just simple malicious idiots and ill preparedness on behalf of the stakeholders who are responsible for this substation, then one would say that yes, this falls in line with the reconnaissance that they've undertaken elsewhere at other locations. And it is known, not necessarily that publicly, that various different nuclear sites have been reviewed and other parts of our critical national infrastructure have been subject to hostile surveillance. The aim of a destructive attack of this type, and we don't know yet whether this may be the case in this instance, is to show weakness and vulnerability, to cause disruption to business as usual, to cause embarrassment to the authorities and stakeholders responsible for the security of these sites, for the general public to lose faith in those authorities and in their stakeholders, that they can rely on them to keep the wheels of commerce turning, and whether that be tourists flying into this country or British nationals flying out on their holidays or on business, to disrupt the busiest airport in the world has significant implications in terms of trust that the general public have in those that are responsible for keeping it safe. But Russia is not alone. Every country of significance, including our own, have specialist teams that will plan and strategize these kinds of attacks against even our enemies. Whether they implement them or not is an entirely different matter. But in the same way as the United States have, as was the Special Activities Division, now known as Ground Branch, we have ourselves what was known as the Increment and now known as the Wing, these hybrids of intelligence officers and special forces are the very optimum and the very best to look at the types of operations that could cause disruption to other foreign states. I've carried out these kinds of surveys and these kind of preparations and protections for data centers, for example, where my teams have undertaken not only physical security reviews, but then subsequent what we call penetration testing, or red cell testing as it's called in the United States, to try and defeat that security covertly, mimicking the most appropriate and relevant threat groups. So mimicking hostile special forces or mimicking local scumbags and malicious individuals and vandals. So again, what CNI needs to be looking at is, are those that are actually reviewing this security doing it sufficiently regularly and by those suitably qualified to be able to do so? This shows a significant failing. And again, quite often the focus could be on the headquarters or Heathrow Airport itself, where the security itself could be very, very good. But that doesn't mean that you are resilient. It's all the supply chain to it, whether it be utilities or even supplies of water or gas for that matter, that you need to consider that if those are denied to that site, what consequences will that have?
Heathrow is an absolutely vital part of our critical national infrastructure. There are over 585,000 electricity substations in the United Kingdom. Why this particular one should have seen an explosion and fire may be entirely coincidental. Coincidences do happen, and we shouldn't rule out the possibility that there is no connection to anything untoward. However, bearing in mind that this is Heathrow, bearing in mind the importance of Heathrow, bearing in mind that on Wednesday, our Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, was, I believe, the first ever British Prime Minister to be seen floating up the River Clyde on a nuclear submarine, and then yesterday laid the keel of the next generation of dreadnought nuclear submarines. This coming within hours means that serious people do have to ask whether it has been a Russian response to the things that Sir Keir was doing and saying, and also the things that our Defence Secretary, John Healy was saying, widely reported, that Russia jolly well needed to be afraid of our ability to obliterate it if push were to come to shove. So it's a win for Russia that you and I are having this conversation, let alone whether there is turns out to be any evidence that Putin's military intelligence service was trying to. I have absolutely no doubt that as you and I are conducting this conversation, MI5 officers and bomb explosive experts are going over this site with a fine tooth comb. We know there was an explosion and we know there was a fire, but we don't know if the explosion came before the fire or after the fire. These are very significant factors. But what we should not forget is not just Russia's ability to hit at us here in the United Kingdom, and Salisbury is a big example, but by no means the only example, but also the case of Dylan Earle, who has pleaded guilty to firebombing a warehouse in Leighton in East London that was used to store military equipment bound for Ukraine. Others were arrested at the time, and they are due to be tried on the 2nd of June of this year. So obviously we can't talk about that. But it is the case that Dylan Earle pleaded guilty not just to the attack, but also to recruiting others, non-Russians significantly, to work for the Russian intelligence service to carry out acts of sabotage. So that's why we are very worried indeed about this Heathrow incident. Yes.